What unites us all as readers is this common love of this thing that we call literature. Today I'm going to be going through my favourite books in the world. I've got 10 of them by my side, and I'm going to be telling you about them, why I love them, why you should also read them if you haven't, and maybe you'll love them just the same as I did. So let's start off with the first one. The first one is Stanislaw Lem's Solaris. I have not talked about this book on my channel, which is unbelievable because it is the book that got me back into literature after about 10 years. Solaris is a psychologically probing and penetrating sci-fi novel, and Stanislaw Lem's prose is so engaging and just really evocative in terms of its imagery. In terms of its themes, it's talking about philosophy and existentialism, the idea of the ghosts of the past coming back to haunt us, and also of exploration and the implications of that. And it's a lot more about running away from grief and finding that grief is essentially a universal thing. It follows you everywhere. It is pervasive, and it even invades this sci-fi novel. You have these characters of Kelvin, who is haunted by decisions that he made in his past, and you have the ghost of this woman called Rhea, who Kelvin was romantically engaged with. The dynamic between Rhea and Kelvin is so fascinating and so terrifying and really sad. Lem's prose is written in such a way as to really intentionally reveal information to you. So in one scene, for instance, Rhea is present in the scene. However, you only realise that at the end of a chapter. It unfolds and then the chapter ends so ambiguously that you're just left with this sick feeling in your stomach. And Lem is a master of this. And reading Solaris, I think it's an extraordinary novel, I really do. And I know it's had acclaim, it's been adapted twice into films, one by Andrei Tarkovsky, the Russian filmmaker, and one by Steven Soderbergh, I believe. The Tarkovsky adaptation of Solaris is very good. It does not hit home for me in the same way as the novel does. I will say the one dirge about this book is the absolute density of the scientific prose, because there are sections where the character will read excerpts from scientific journals, and these can be very laborious to get through. However, this was when I was really out of reading, so coming to this book, this took me over a month to read, which now I would be able to finish in a few days. Whether my perception of that is as accurate as it should be, I do not know. At the time, it was a real dirge, so bear that in mind if you're a new reader. Number 2 is Sally Rooney's Normal People. I'm contrarian in nature, so if anyone is raving about anything, be it a movie or a book, I'm dubious of it. Because I think, well, am I being forced to like this? And that's just part of my psychology, I can't change that. Normal People, however, when I finally read it, is extraordinary. It's a simple premise in terms of it's just following two people over years in their lives and how their relationship never quite works. It's infuriating. Characters make dumb decisions that you just want to scream at them for. But these people are real, they feel real. Her prose is beautiful, and her characters are so memorable, and their relationship is so absorbing. If you are willing to go along with her style, you'll have a wonderful time, and you will be really sucked into the lives of these people, and probably screaming at them at many points in the novel. Read it at your own pace, become a part of these characters' lives, and love listening to them, love hearing from them. It's basically like meeting an old friend, is how I felt about it in certain parts. It's so familiar feeling. This novel, next one, is one that I, for many years of my life, and may still to this day, consider to be my favourite. This is Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange. I've got a very old beat-up edition of this that I've had for about 15 years. Anthony Burgess was under the impression that he had some form of cancer during writing this novel. And so he dedicated all his time to finishing it, and then when the novel was published and became a big hit, the cancer was either, I can't remember, it was either benign or did not exist in the first place.
Bang! And the dirt is gone!
The motivation of death really got into him, and he just published this extraordinary novel. A Clockwork Orange tells of Alex DeLarge and his gang of droogs. These are these sort of ultra-violent young thugs who just engage in acts of debauchery. The language and the way in which Burgess writes is the joy of reading A Clockwork Orange, because there are vile, disgusting things happening in nearly every chapter, in basically every chapter. However, the way it is told to you is so beautiful. Burgess writes in what is called Nadsat, which is a mixture of Russian and English. The language itself is very musical, it's very rhythmic. A Clockwork Orange is marvellous. It is not for everybody, it is probably an acquired taste situation. But if you're willing to let yourself go to the language and the rhythm and the feel of it, it's better than most anything that I've ever read. And it's stuck with me for over 12 years, probably since I first read this. Next is Heart of a Dog by Mikhail Bulgakov. Bulgakov. The Heart of a Dog tells of a scientist in Moscow and this dog that he finds out in the street, and the dog he decides to perform medical experiments on, in which he imparts the testicles of a recently deceased man, and thus the dog becomes more mannish in a sense. He becomes more intelligent. He begins to be able to talk. It's just essentially the madcap exploration of scientific endeavour and of man's folly and playing God. And it's really one of the funniest, most ridiculous things I've ever read. You will love it. Next, one of my most recent books that I've finished, and the biggest book that I've ever read, David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest. I'm going to be one of those guys, I'm going to say Infinite Jest is one of my favourite books ever. Was it the most enjoyable reading experience? No. The reason being, it's 981 pages of book and about 100 pages of endnotes. However, the story and the way in which it is told, and the characters involved, and what David Foster Wallace was exploring in Infinite Jest are beyond fascinating. The story essentially follows this whole wide-ranging cast of characters. Now, I incorrectly informed you when I gave my Infinite Jest update that this is about the search for Infinite Jest, this being this mystical tape that, when you watch it, transports you into the state of catatonia. This is not true. I think that the main idea of Infinite Jest, yes, granted, contains this mystical tape that does essentially knock you comatose, but the main idea of it is exploring addiction through a whole range of lens, whether that be literal addiction to something very obvious such as drugs, an addiction to entertainment, an addiction to the pursuit of greatness, that being the tennis academy, and everyone's vices are all explored in this book. It is one of those, what did you call it, encyclopedic novels. It's really exploring a bit of everything here. People know it to be like sort of funny and very dry and postmodern. I tend to lean on the idea that this is a really sad book. There are characters who go through unbelievable torment because of their vices. David Foster Wallace's granular forensic exploration into the breakdown of a body because of the toll that drugs takes on it, it's horrifying to read. It's so disturbing. I've always been very angry at the idea of someone taking drugs recreationally just because of the absolute consequences that people can have because of drugs. And this book not only affirmed my own notion that drugs are one of the most evil vices, but also really made me learn some empathy as to the people that go through the addiction to drugs. You're just mourning for these people the whole time. It's a really transcendent and mind-altering novel. Make this the time that you read this book because it is extraordinary in its power. Going from the longest book I've ever read to one of the shortest ones on this list, Philip Ross, Everyman. Everyman begins with the funeral of the titular Everyman, and then having explored the scene of the funeral, it then travels back through the life of this Everyman and essentially explores a lot of themes of Jewishness, of sexual identity, of adultery, of relationships between men and women, and about mortality. Mortality is probably the most pervasive thing in this book. Everyman really opened my eyes to the sort of isolatory and lonely feeling of getting older and of not being able to turn the tide on one's own life. It's so scary. It's a really scary book to read, but Roth's prose is so beautiful in the way in which he moves so seamlessly between the past and the present. If you're a fan of Philip Roth, give it a go. If you're not a fan of Philip Roth, I understand why. I think there are a lot of people who don't like Philip Roth's work. What's wrong with you? What's wrong with you? He's a terrific writer. Anyway, next. This is a book that I've also called my favourite book, and that's Louis Buñuel's My Last Breath. This is a memoir / autobiography, whatever you want to call it, about the Spanish filmmaker, I think Spanish or Portuguese, I think he's Spanish. Spanish filmmaker Louis Buñuel. Buñuel is probably one of the most famous surrealist artists out there. Buñuel's writing in My Last Breath is less about the films he has made and it's more about his life in general, and it's a life and a half. I mean, the amount of things Buñuel got up to as a young man and as an older man, it's extraordinary all he's done in his life. If you don't know anything about Buñuel, that's a fantastic place to start. Personally, before I read My Last Breath, I'd watched 2 of Buñuel's movies. I'd watched The Discreet Charm and Belle de Jour. I liked neither. I thought that they were interesting, but they just didn't click with me in any way at all. I think the surrealism left me sort of cold to them. However, reading that book, I gained an entirely renewed interest in his work and just appreciating how his life reflects in the films he makes. You know what? As a piece of prose, it's wonderfully written. He writes about childhood so evocatively. You can tell, actually, his obsession with flashback scenes and of the past really comes through in this, because the way he writes about the past is just, oh, it's brilliant. Yeah, I love that book. I really do. I need to reread it, actually. I might do that this year. Next, we have Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. The story is told from Scout's perspective, that being this young girl who is the daughter of Atticus Finch, who is a lawyer. And Atticus Finch is on the case for this young black man called Tom Walker. And Tom Walker is being accused of sexual crimes, basically. The book doesn't really tackle that until the last, let's say, third of it. That's not really what the story is about at the start. It's really about building an atmosphere and building to a complete crescendo of dread that just looms all over the first 2/3 of this book, and the way Harper writes is so extraordinary, and you just get completely sucked into this world. It envelops you. This is the only book that Harper Lee ever truly wanted to be released, and you owe it to yourself really to read it. I think it's one of those very rare books that manages to tackle prejudice without ever coming across as preachy. And as we live in this modern day where prejudice is so frequently explored in our works, it's very good to find something that doesn't feel like it is whacking you over the head. Give this book a go, you've got to. I'm going to move on to my penultimate choice for one of my favourite books, which is Charles Bukowski's Ham on Rye. Previously, before having read this, I would have put on Pulp, which is a very short, very funny and very stupid film noir-esque novel. And anyway, Ham on Rye is his very autobiographical, more autobiographical than usual probably, novel about his childhood and just how he grew up, and basically revealing to you all how he got to be the man that he is, the cantankerous, grumbly bastard that he is, or was rather. It's one of the most beautifully written, most painful to read evocations of childhood that I've ever read. It makes your heart yearn to be able to give young Bukowski a hug. It really does. But then you see who he's grown up to and you're like, you don't want a hug. It's so funny. It's so solitudinous, if that's a word. Bukowski is just the master of keeping you going along. He will make you laugh about anything. And I think that's a really important skill when talking about something that is so sad, that being Bukowski's childhood and the abuse and the pain that he went through, and still became an extraordinary poet and writer. So we must be thankful for that, because some people take the brunt of the world's suffering on their shoulders and they became special, powerful artists.
But my father was a great literary teacher. He taught me the meaning of pain. Pain without reason.
The final book that I'm going to talk about, this is another book, so let's say one of three maybe, that I would call my favourite. This is a very gorgeous hardback edition, a folio edition, of Cormac McCarthy's The Road. The Road is very famous. Everyone knows about it, or at least knows the concept of it, and it follows a father and son who are making their way through this post-apocalyptic vision of America and essentially just trying to survive. Is there a narrative in The Road? Yes, there is. Is there a clear, defined plot? Personally, no. I think that it's more of a thing of you have a beginning point, you have the end point. Everything else that happens in between, though there is a clear middle, I think, is more about building the world and you just travelling, because essentially all this book is moving. Moving, stopping, moving again. And that is essentially the story of perseverance that these people go through. Why I love this book. Firstly, McCarthy is a master wordsmith. Yes, this book is not Blood Meridian in its prose. I don't think it needs to be. No book, apart from Blood Meridian, needs to be Blood Meridian. The Road is stripped back in its prose comparatively. However, the descriptions that it uses are so evocative. You know, we have all the trees that are grey and stripped bare. You have the blood, which is red. You have the sky, which is often grey and very rarely blue. And you have these extraordinary passages of dialogue between the father and son, which are so economic in what's being said. However, everything that needs to be said is there, and what's not said and what's not stated is the absolute honest love that they have for each other. It brought me close to tears in several scenes just because of how painfully authentic this relationship felt to me. The Road is also the only book, and this is genuinely true, where I was jump scared by words. There's a scene where something is revealed to you very suddenly, and I genuinely jumped. And it's like, how can you jump from reading? It's ridiculous, but that's the power of this book, and it's a story that has always stuck with me, and I've so often tried to replicate it just in my own stories, in my own ideas, and McCarthy himself is, if not my favourite author, very close to being my favourite. Let me know your favourites in the comments down below. Let me know if you have any major disagreements with mine. If you hate any of mine, please tell me, and I would be very curious to hear as to why. Yeah, just thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video. I'm planning on doing some deconstructions and some sort of longer videos on some of the favourites mentioned here, so look out for those, and I will see you in whatever I'm doing next. Yeah. Bye bye.